You may be seated. My Uncle John is a tree hugger, or used to be at least. I learned this when I joined him on his morning run one day years ago. He and Aunt Lanita lived in a beautiful wooded community north of Seattle, appropriately called Woodway. And about halfway through our run, John said, "Hold on a second, I like to hug this tree right here when I come this way." Now, the tree in front of us was a magnificent Douglas fir, one that towered above all the hemlocks and the lesser evergreens around it. And John, who was actually not a grizzled earth-firster, but a respected internist at Swedish Hospital, John spread his arms as wide as they'd go and pressed his gray-haired chest against the tree's great trunk. He closed his eyes. He laid a cheek on the bark. John said he liked to pray like this sometimes. And I watched, and I wondered what an answer to a prayer like that one might even look like. Now, forgive me if you find them cute, but ever since that day, I have really disliked those little face kits that can be tacked onto the sides of trees. You know the ones I mean? I suppose they're meant to add a little personality, as it were, but a tree can be made to look a little bit more human only by taking away some of its treeness, if you will. And I think this is a loss. You see, as far as I know, John never walked up to his largest human neighbor, embraced him, laid his face on his chest, and prayed. Humans are fine enough creatures in their own right. But I think the prayers that great big Douglas fir drew out of my uncle were about being in the presence of something that wasn't changed at all by his presence. The tree drove John to prayer in part because the tree was oblivious to him. It drove him to prayer because it would not respond to him in the least. Now, that may seem like a strange thing to say about prayer, that sometimes prayer can be about feeling your smallness, your insignificance, your impotence even. That it can be about knowing your prayers might not change anything, maybe not even God. But there is an aspect to prayer that's precisely this. There is an aspect to prayer that's about refusing to tack little human faces onto God and simply being still in the presence of what we do not know and what we have no power to change. One such prayer is called the Book of Job. It's been said that the Book of Job is about the problem of suffering, but I don't think Job's suffering is the main point. Pain may just be a very reliable old way into the realm of all that we can't make sense of as human beings. Maybe you remember how the story begins. The Satan, which means the adversary or the accuser in Hebrew, comes to God after wandering to and fro on the earth. God asks whether Satan's considered his servant Job. And Satan says, anyone can be faithful when life's going well. When things make sense to you and you think you're in control, he says, let me have a go at this guy, and then let's see what happens. And so Job loses everything. Job loses livestock and servants. He loses his house and his children and his wealth. He tears his robe, shaves his head, and says, naked I came from my mother's womb, and naked shall I return there. The Lord gave, and the Lord's taken away. Blessed be the name of the Lord. Job refuses to curse God even after he's infected with sores from the soles of his feet to the crown of his head. He is such a terrifying spectacle that when 3 friends arrive to console him, they tear their robes and sit with him for 7 days and 7 nights without speaking a word. But all this dramatic setup takes place in just the first 2 chapters of the book. The rest of the book, the next 40 chapters, are a long and beautiful but very failed attempt to make any sense whatsoever of Job's sufferings. That's the point of those first 2 chapters, right? They make clear that this guy's suffering, at least, makes no sense at all. He's done nothing to deserve it, and he knows he's done nothing to deserve it. Well, then when Job's friends break their silence on the 8th day, their explanations of his situation are famously lame. And Job rejects them all outright. He won't accept that he deserves the suffering, And in today's reading, he's turned from his friends and gone looking for some answers from God. Job says, "Oh, that I knew where I might find him, that I might come even to his dwelling. I would lay my case before him and fill my mouth with arguments. I would learn what he would answer me and understand what he would say to me." And unfortunately, God doesn't play along. Job can fill his mouth right up with arguments, but he'll get no explanations from God. This seems to be a notable difference between God and human beings in this story. Human beings are full of explanations about why things are, and God has no interest in them whatsoever. God doesn't argue. In fact, as the story plays on out, none of the human characters will even ever learn about this terrible agreement between God and the adversary that started all this. Not even in the supposedly happy ending, where Job gets back twice the number of cattle and houses and wealth and children that he lost. Not even then does Job get an explanation. All he gets from God is an eloquent reminder that there's a whole bunch of knowledge in this universe that's just way above the pay grade of even a wise and righteous man like Job. And so the story of Job may seem like pretty cold comfort to the likes of us, right? Is there really anything good about the news that there is so much in this life and this universe that you and I will never, ever comprehend? There's an anonymous Christian text from the 14th century called The Cloud of Unknowing. And in it we read this: "We can know so many things. Through God's grace, our minds can explore, understand, and reflect on creation and even on God's own works. But we can't think our way to God. That's why I'm willing to abandon everything I know, to love the one thing I cannot think." The failure of our understanding can help us. When we reach the end of what we know, that's where we find God. So maybe the lesson of Job is actually not that human beings are stupid and small. The lesson of Job is that the failure of our understanding actually can help us. When we reach the end of what we know, that is where we find God. Our minds are made to figure things out. I believe this is a gift of God. But there is a kind of restful wonder that we can only find when we learn to stop those minds and be still. There's a kind of restful wonder that waits for us off in that place where all the explanations cease. In the service of Compline, among those last prayers of the day, there is one strange little prayer that I especially love. It says, "Be present, O merciful God, and protect us through the hours of this night, so that we who are wearied by the changes and chances of this life may rest in your eternal changelessness." I find solace in this prayer, in the changelessness of God, even if I have no idea exactly what it means. I may find solace in it because maybe it's something like what I imagine John must have been praying as he leaned into that great big fir tree that day. I think he prayed there because the tree wouldn't shift under his weight. It wouldn't bend down in response to the changes and chances of his much smaller life. Maybe his prayers opened with a tree that couldn't hear him, because what we need most from God sometimes are actually not answers. What we need sometimes are not explanations. What we need sometimes are not even solutions or responses to the changes and chances that weary us. Sometimes what we need deeper down is rest. Rest in one who does not change. Rest that may still come from abandoning what we know and loving the one thing we cannot think. Amen.